Dragon Quest, released in 1985, followed closely by Final Fantasy in 1987, becoming the first turn-based JRPGs to really break through into the mainstream and legitimize the genre. Final Fantasy released a great success and positive reviews. First released in Japan for the Famicom, Final Fantasy received many updated versions that include updated audio, visuals, and new content. For this video, I played the PlayStation Portable 20th Anniversary Edition released in 2007. Final Fantasy features 4 Warriors of Light, identified by the crystals they carry with them. These crystals are a powerful source of magical energy used to help keep the world in balance, with the antagonists of this world wanting to use the crystal's power for their own evil deeds. The start of the game explains that while you have the 4 elemental crystals in your possession, 4 fiends exist that are draining the crystals of their power and causing harm to the natural world. You find yourself in the Kingdom of Corneria, and after introducing yourself to the king, you find out that the princess has been kidnapped by a rogue knight named Garland. After Garland has been dealt with, the king orders the bridge connecting to the east to be built so that the Warriors of Light can track down the 4 fiends, restore power to the crystals, and bring peace to the land. The story is simple. As you explore the world further, you'll come across places negatively affected by the fiends. It makes sense that if you want to progress, you have to interact with the world and these people, in order to solve their problems and become the hero. You'll travel to the fiends' dungeons, they get their 5 minutes in the spotlight, you'll fight them and move on to the next. Within the first half of the game, in Crescent Lake, you'll get interesting context to the plot that adds a unique layer to it. Final Fantasy's story starts to find its own identity with this story element. I was surprised to see something like this, especially for its time, but it doesn't go far enough as it doesn't affect the world or change your goals during the events of the game. The 4 Warriors of Light's name and class is chosen by the player at the start of the game. You'll choose between the 6 classes: Warrior, Monk, Thief, White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage. Warriors can equip heavy armor and weapons and have the strongest defense in the game. Monks specialize in empty-handed combat or light weapons. Monks have the highest attack output, in return for them having lower defense and not being able to equip heavy armor. Thieves have high evasion and accuracy. They have a very limited selection of armor and weapons, but greater agility and luck. White and Black Mages have poor combat stats, but learn the strongest healing and enhancement, and damage and debuff spells respectively. Finally, the Red Mage is moderately skilled in every field, but doesn't excel in any. Red Mages have access to most White and Black Mage skills, and fight similarly to, but not as strong as the Warrior class. I think they do just enough with these classes, giving them unique designs, unique moves, spells, stats, and equipment. On top of that, classes can be upgraded later in the game, further strengthening their abilities and stats. It's great that each of these classes is meant to fill a specific role, and for the most part they do. But it means nothing when one of this game's greatest weaknesses is extremely simplistic combat that remain throughout the entirety of the game. Standard basic attacks from every class besides the White and Black Mages provide you with consistent damage that will carry you through the whole game. My playthrough consisted of a Warrior, Monk, and 2 Red Mages, and 95% of the game's combat was solved by only using the most basic attack. The only other situations where something else is called for isn't to get yourself out of any danger, but rather to speed things up in order to end the fight in less turns. Larger groups of enemies can be dispatched by using offensive multi-target black magic, while using buff magic can increase your damage output to end boss battles faster. Every boss in the main game I was able to beat within 3 to 5 turns, with the same strategy of using Temper and Haste on my Warrior and Monk. After a certain point, it's not even common to need to heal, as you don't take enough damage in any one encounter to need it during combat. The only thing I can think of that requires attention during combat are status effects, mainly poison. Status effects can temporarily take away the character's ability to use certain attacks, or lose your turn altogether. Poison's a semi-frequent occurrence that's a nuisance more than anything. Bring Antidote, or the spell Poisona, tend to poison when it comes up and you'll be fine. Since half of the classes, Warrior, Monk, and Thief, rely on their physical attack stat, their basic attack becomes their only real means of damage. This remains the same throughout the entire game, resulting in the combat not engaging me at all. There were plenty of times I had to find something else to do outside of the game just to occupy my mind for the minutes spent in each combat encounter, just pressing A over and over again. Spells are the only thing in the game that can add a layer of strategy to combat, but combat is so simple it doesn't require you to engage with any of it. On top of that, magic is limited by the amount of MP the party character has, and must be restored with items or at town's inns, while basic attacks don't consume any kind of resource. In almost every town, there are black mage and white mage shops. You can spend your gil at these shops to equip spells to the classes capable of learning them. Spells are categorized from level 1 to level 8. Additionally, only 3 spells maximum per level can be assigned to a character. Magic works interestingly in this game. Simplistic for sure, but there's a clear sense of progression and reward for making it to a new town and purchasing a new set of stronger skills for your magic users, alongside gear for other classes. Some gear, when equipped, gives users access to an extra spell, but it's really hidden in the combat menu. You'll have to select items, press up to pull up your gear, then select the piece of gear that has that bonus spell to cast. Instead, they could have just listed the spell in the magic category, while adding the gear icon next to it, making it easier to find, and indicating that it's tied to your equipment. This is a very early adaptation of role-playing combat, so I was very understanding of its simplicity. I'm glad that they found something that works in 1987, while being streamlined and easy for the player to figure out. However, these future iterations of Final Fantasy I could have expanded upon the combat while not taking away from the original's simplistic design. They started to do this by adding items from future Final Fantasy games, such as Phoenix Down, stronger potions, ether, and more status healing items. They also added more HP to bosses. They could expand the boss fights by adding even more health so they stay alive for more than 5 turns. They could add new strategies in order to defeat them, like adding another target that needs to be removed first in order to make the boss vulnerable, or add multiple limbs as separate targets that each get a turn to attack. Basic enemies could also use some love by increasing their stats. There were a lot of times later in the game where an enemy would attack, just doing a single point of damage to my warrior. On the player side, you could add class-specific abilities to the warrior, monk, and thief classes, like the ones featured in Final Fantasy VI, with Sabin's Blitz and Cyan's Bushido. This would provide you more options rather than just simply using your basic attack to win every fight. Future games also consistently introduced and swapped out characters in order to keep the strategies and combat fresh. Overall, the combat could use even more continued balancing and tweaks to make it more engaging for the player. I don't think any of these changes need to be made, rather I'm happy these things were shown to be expanded upon properly in Final Fantasy's many sequels, and it's nice to have this as a reference to where it started. With very little to talk about mechanically or for the game's story, I thought it would be worth breaking down the first half of the game and how well it silently guides you without any objective markers. It's certainly not perfect, but generally Final Fantasy gives you the space to wander and get lost, while still giving you the insight and goals to navigate properly through the world. The game's intro is really well designed. You start the game outside of the first town, Corneria. You'll see the king who acknowledges your status as the Warrior of Light, and asks you to travel north to rescue his kidnapped daughter from a rogue knight named Garland. The beginning area is separated from the rest of the world, allowing for a secluded space the player can't get lost in. There are only 2 main points of interest, being Corneria and the Chaos Shrine to the north. It's a small enough area that you'll never stray too far from the starting town, where you'll be able to restock on items and restore health at the end. With your first goal made clear, you'll head north to the Chaos Shrine. It's a small single-floor dungeon with a boss fight with Garland at the end. Once Garland's defeated, you'll bring the princess back to Corneria Castle. The king will then order for the bridge connecting this area to the rest of the world to be finished, so that the Warriors of Light can pursue their main goal and restore power to the world's 4 crystals, prompting the true start of the game. While exploring this newly opened area, you'll most likely stumble upon Matoya's cave to the north. This is where you'll find Matoya, whose crystal lens was stolen, so she can't see very well. As a good-natured Warrior of Light, you'll want to help Matoya. This plants in your mind that you'll need to come back here after obtaining a crystal lens. Continuing to wander to the east will bring you to the second point of interest, the town of Pravoka. Here you'll hear the townsfolk complain about the gang of pirates terrorizing the town. After dealing with the pirate problem, the leader will then offer his ship to the Warriors of Light as an apology. An odd interaction for sure, but one that certainly moves the plot forward. The ship is accessible from the harbor south of town, and can only be boarded and exited from other existing harbors. At this time, the ship can only explore a small part of the ocean. You'll find 3 harbors, a shortcut back to Corneria, a path to the northwest, and a path to the southwest. Before you leave town, however, the townsfolk will talk about Matoya and how she can make special herbs, reinforcing Matoya's importance. Regardless of which way you go first, you'll learn more about how to proceed. Heading northwest brings you to the Dwarf Cave, who speak about needing nitro power in order to continue their work and can help you reach the Western Sea. Heading southwest brings you to the next town, and the castle of Elfheim. Here you'll learn that the prince has been asleep for years, put under a curse by Astos, meaning stopping Astos and waking the prince is the key to progression and becomes another objective. Heading northwest, you'll find a castle with a king who's lost his crown that the townsfolk of Elfheim mentioned. So far, this game does an excellent job letting you explore multiple paths in the order you choose. You'll be given multiple objectives and insights about the world, offering hints on how to proceed. These shed a light on problems that need resolving. Already you have Matoya's missing crystal lens, the cursed sleeping prince of Elfheim, the Western Keep's king's missing crown, and the dwarf's request for nitro powder. Knowing that you need these items, you'll head to the last destination available to be explored, and the first main dungeon of Final Fantasy, the Marsh Cave. Dungeons in Final Fantasy are very simplistic, maze-like areas. They have nothing in the way or of interest other than the high encounter rate and treasure chests. The earlier areas are small enough to not cause much of a fuss, but the level design and encounter rate for the larger, later dungeons can make for a tedious experience. With no identifiable areas or landmarks, wandering results in a slow experience with many stop-and-go encounters. Because this content was originally made so early when the genre was still experimenting with standards, I can overlook the simplicity. But when making improvements on this base, a map is definitely necessary to help streamline navigation and progression. Whether it be a complete map, or a real-time map that fills in as you explore, it's a huge quality of life addition I think the game needs. A mini-map or a large transparent overlay map could have easily been set to toggle with a single button in future releases. The only type of navigational help you get is with the White Mage's spell Exit and the Black Mage's spell Teleport. Exit will warp you out of the dungeon, and Teleport will return you to the previous floor. I always appreciated the inclusion of abilities like these that make getting around faster. Having these as spells adds nice utility and strengthens the role of mages. I don't like how it nerfs your combat potential, as those spells could take up precious magic slots. While not practical, someone might also want to play through the game without any mages, and it would prove to make simple dungeon navigation that bit more inconvenient. I prefer when items fill these kinds of roles, even including both methods so the player can choose. But in the end, I don't think there's only one right way to include them. A lot of times tiles in front of chests trigger specific enemy encounters, and while it makes sense the first time, those tiles always trigger the encounter. There were multiple times I would win the fight and accidentally move away from the chest and step back, which required I fight the same encounter a second time. It's just a nitpick, but something that slowed the game down nonetheless. While the system did pay me back when I needed to grind to level 99, I think this could be better served if those encounters either only trigger once, or activate again after moving 3 or more spaces away from it. On the final floor of Marsh Cave lies the King's Crown. Bring the crown back to the king to start a boss fight. After the fight, the boss drops the crystal lens, and this is where the puzzle pieces will start to fall into place. If you remember your first visit to Matoya's cave, you'll know that the crystal lens belongs to Matoya. The townsfolk in Pravoka talked about Matoya's ability to make special herbs, so your reward for returning the crystal lens is the Jolt Tonic, which you should then link to the sleeping prince of Elfheim. Give the prince the Jolt Tonic, and wake him up and he'll reward you with the Mystic Key. This is the first time the game doesn't explicitly point you in the right direction, but up to this point there have been many doors in castles, towns, and dungeons that are locked and need the Mystic Key. You know that the only request left to be fulfilled is finding and bringing nitro powder to the dwarves in order to gain access to the Western Sea. So the pacing slows down here, allowing you to revisit each previously explored area in the game with the newly acquired Mystic Key. I like this point in the game as I started to get familiar with the geography in the world, and got to revisit and further explore areas to naturally gain more levels, gain better gear, items, and gil. This is the first opportunity for miscommunication with the player. You could simply not be able to find the right place containing the nitro powder, as it's not in a spot you're likely to revisit. I think somewhere between the start of the game and where you are now, some NPC should have mentioned explosives stored in the castle, so you can make that connection with the dwarves. But to my knowledge, it's never mentioned. You're just supposed to explore all previously explored areas thoroughly enough to eventually find the treasure rooms in Corneria Castle that were previously inaccessible without the key. It's the first inconsistent guidance from the game, but here you'll find the nitro powder to give to the dwarves. After making your way back to the Dwarven Cave, you'll give Narek the nitro powder, and he'll open up the passage to the Greater Sea. Here you'll be able to sail across the rest of the sea, giving you access to more shortcuts and new areas. The closest port would be to the west, reaching the town of Melmond, Titan's Cave, and the Earth Cave. You'll want to visit Melmond, as it's right next to the harbor. You'll want to rest, upgrade gear, and magic. The townsfolk of Melmond mention vampires plaguing the streets, the existence of a Titan, and you'll meet Dr. Un, who likes to study ancient languages. The only thing I would add is that Dr. Un is located in the top rightmost corner of the map, almost hidden to the player. There's a really long gap between your first visit to Melmond and when you need to talk to Dr. Un, making this another awkwardly communicated part of the game. I think it could have been improved just by moving Dr. Un to the center of town, where you can see him and talk to him. Further exploring this part of the world will either bring you to Titan Cave, which is currently blocked by the previously mentioned Titan, and the second main dungeon of the game, the Earth Cave. The third floor of the cave brings you to the vampire that's wreaking havoc on the town of Melmond. Take care of him to be rewarded with a Star Ruby. Process of elimination removes the vampires and Dr. Un, leaving the Titan as the final roadblock. Entering Titan's Cave introduces you to Sarda the Sage, giving you the Earth Rod to gain access to lower levels of the Earth Cave. It's a bit redundant to repeat the same dungeon twice, but it's short enough. At the bottom of the Earth Cave awaits the Lich and the Earth Crystal. My first real complaint with the playthrough comes specific to the versions that contain the additional Soul of Chaos dungeons. You start to get some mixed signals in what order to do things. Entrances to the 4 Soul of Chaos dungeons are blocked off by a statue of that respective boss. And after defeating Lich, you get a cutscene specifically showing you the removal of the first statue. If you're playing these versions for the first time like I was, you aren't going to know that this is new content added to be taken on later in the game, with higher levels and gear. By the time you beat Lich, you can enter the first Soul of Chaos dungeon, and once you enter, you can't escape until you either clear the dungeon or get a game over. It's not even balanced, as I was able to make it to the final floor, but got one-shot by every boss on that floor. Because the game showed me this location in a cutscene, I thought it was telling me to enter in order to progress the story. It gave me a false sense of security as I was able to reach the bosses of the dungeon, just to be unable to proceed, being a frustrating waste of time for me. I think this content would have been much better introduced if they all open up at the same time after restoring all 4 crystals, then have the dungeon encounters rebalanced for the endgame content. Up to this point, I was used to the game subtly giving me information or access to areas to explore at a natural pace, that I was so caught off guard when I was directly shown a cutscene of a new area that had just opened up. It clashes with the original game's design, and you aren't even ready for this content once it shines a spotlight on it. Back on track, if you ignore the newly opened Soul of Chaos, you'll realize that there's one last harbor on the east side of the continent that is last to be explored, bringing you to Crescent Lake. Here you'll find the sages that give you more insight on the 4 crystals and the fiends guarding their power. In particular, they mention the Fire Fiend, located in a nearby volcano, bringing you to Mount Gulg. The last thing I'll mention after Mount Gulg is the process for getting the airship, because it's the most cryptic part of the game, and an example of an awful job guiding the player. An NPC in Crescent Town mentions a cave to the north, which results in obtaining the Levystone. What's odd is that 2 NPCs are looking for the Levystone, the Crescent Town NPC and a Mount Duger dwarf. Neither of them actually take it. What you're actually supposed to do is bring the Levystone to a patch of desert south of Crescent Town in the overworld, and I have no idea how you're supposed to know that. I wasn't able to find mention of where to bring the Levystone in my playthrough. The place you bring it isn't even a fully realized location you can explore. only after you go there with the stone does a cutscene trigger, introducing you to Ryukon Desert. What's even worse, the original NES release needed you to select the Levy Stone while in the right area, making it even more cryptic. This could have easily been solved if Ryukon Desert was an area you could enter and find something of interest to interact with that links it to the Levy Stone. Once the airship's obtained, you're free to explore the northern half of the world and search for the third and fourth crystal. As you can see, Final Fantasy does a good job giving you the freedom to explore while introducing you to the problems of the world. You're rewarded for recalling information and relating that info with key items found during your journey. Aside from the good feeling reached when solving these puzzles, you're rewarded with access to new areas and new problems, continuing that gameplay loop, and getting another step closer to saving the world. In 2004, the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy released, including bonus content titled The Soul of Chaos. This content made its way into the 2007 PSP release that I played. The Soul of Chaos includes 4 new dungeons and can double your playtime with the amount of content. The downside is that it's not content related to the main story, and it can be very tedious. But on the bright side, it's unique content that celebrates the 20th anniversary of Final Fantasy. Dungeons are unlocked after beating the respective fiend, whose statue's blocking the entrance. I spoke a little bit before, but these areas tend to be unbalanced in the way that enemies in the dungeon are much less of a threat compared to the bosses within them. It's frustrating that for no reason in particular when you enter a dungeon, there's no way to leave it unless you complete the dungeon or get a game over. If you mistakenly enter the dungeon not knowing what you're getting into, your only options are to exit the game and reload previous saves, or slowly work through the dungeon to get a game over. The other most egregious part of the Soul of Chaos dungeons is the fact that 3 out of 4 of them need to be repeated multiple times if you want to fight all the bosses. The first dungeon, Earthgift Shrine, must be done 4 times and consists of 5 floors. Hellfire Chasm twice with 10 floors, Lifespring Grotto twice with 20 floors, and Whispering Cove once with 40 floors. This is a tedious and artificial way to inflate playtime. Going through the dungeon multiple times isn't difficult, and it's repeated content. Instead, once you reach a floor with bosses in them, you shouldn't be locked into only choosing one. You should just have the option to fight one or all of them before moving on. What might make this worth it, and what I think is really unique anniversary content, is that each dungeon's bosses are taken from future Final Fantasy games complete with their own respective musical themes in the PSP version. It's such a neat surprise taking the first Final Fantasy game and adding future games' bosses into the older game. It's a neat surprise for longtime Final Fantasy fans that celebrates the series. Even if you don't recognize these bosses, some of these fights are the best in the game for one reason: they're actually challenging. The problem remains that the encounters in these areas aren't much harder than anything outside of them. Once you slay the 4 fiends, you should be an appropriate level to clear the first 2 dungeons bosses. But the final 2 dungeons bosses, highly recommend having all characters at level 99 in order to stand a chance. So what does this mean? That means hours of grinding. If you choose to pursue this content, it doubles the dungeon count and adds a lot of playtime. But it's a lot of grinding and a lot of repeated content, with only the bosses being the highlight. You don't get anything besides better gear and the satisfaction of completing this content, which is fine since it's generally endgame content. But it would be cool to get something like a brand new phase for the final boss, or something similar once all the Soul of Chaos fights have been defeated, given the fact that you'll be way over leveled for the boss fight if you decide to take on this content. It would rebalance the endgame and reward those wanting to take on the extra content. Regardless, giving you access to these areas at the same time after gathering all of the crystals, and rebalancing the random encounters to be a bit more challenging, would streamline and not interrupt the main story's progression. Letting you leave at any time and removing the need to complete these dungeons multiple times would flat out make this content more enjoyable. As it stands currently, it's a lot of tedious content with fun boss fights as a reward. But these boss fights take just a fraction of the time to complete, and it might discourage players who feel the rest of the repeated dungeon crawling is not worth it and a waste of time. Additionally, added to the 2007 PSP version was an additional 5th dungeon called the Labyrinth of Time. Once all 4 crystals have been restored, the entrance is revealed in the Chaos Shrine. This is the hardest dungeon in the entire game, with a large focus on puzzles, ending with the hardest fight in the game against the super boss. This dungeon has unique attributes. If you take too long to solve a puzzle, fog will roll in, sapping the party's HP and increasing the encounter rate. Depending on how many puzzles you successfully complete, also affects how strong the super boss is. It's a neat way to put the focus on puzzles, while relating it to the combat and difficulty. These mechanics uniquely challenge your endurance, but due to this being an endgame dungeon, you'll most likely have max cash and be able to max out on all items to help you through it. It's still cool to see that with each new version, it means new content that tries to solve the lack of difficulty in the main game. I'm a really big fan of this game's visual interpretation of the NES release. Environments, characters, and enemies all feel faithful to both the original pixel art and the concept art, while feeling like a proper evolution. Towns are beautiful. They use warm colors to provide this cozy and relaxing feeling. Warm sunlight and passing clouds are shown above. Sit in these towns for just a moment, and the atmosphere is palpable. Towns succeed by being a proper juxtaposition to the dim dark caves and sprawling overworld. They provide relief and a safe space to restore HP and MP, stock up on items, and get stronger by buying new gear and spells. A small nitpick I'd like to see addressed would be a small visual indication of the town limits. Anytime you walk outside of the town limits, it'll return you to the overworld. The problem being there were a few moments where I would either unintentionally leave town, or I wouldn't know that there was more of the town to explore, since it was unclear where these limits were. They generally do a good job guiding the player with trees or fences, but it doesn't always work. Adding something consistent like grass lining the limits, or a clearer dotted line would end any confusion. Including a town map for towns could also solve this problem. Towns contrast the dungeons that consist mostly of dark caves and crumbling castles. However, each area has its own coat of paint and includes varied environments. The 4 crystals are themed after the elements of earth, fire, water, and air. It makes sense that these dungeons will follow that basic influence of those elements and different biomes of the world. They really made most of the basic locations and even the basic sprite work of the NES release. To the credit of the original, there are still some unique areas like the Sunken Shrine and Flying Fortress that see themselves fully realized with the enhanced visuals. These environments extend into the battle screen. Each area has a unique background relating to the location. Characters have very simple animations, but each spell has its own unique animation. My running complaint with the first 6 Final Fantasy games is how static the enemies are. I feel like I'm fighting lifeless JPEGs. While understandable for the original release, I wish they would do just a bit more for the future iterations when bringing the game to stronger hardware. When attacking, enemies simply flash. Adding just a few different sprites like an attack, magic casting, or low health sprite would make them feel more lively, while communicating more information to the player. The upgrade in hardware and visuals still goes such a long way to fully realize the original environments, and provide sprite work much more timeless compared to its 8-bit counterpart. Despite the progress made in cleaning up the original release to what is now the PSP release, there's still some questionable quality of life changes that are omitted or could easily be added to this version of the game. The NES controller only had 4 buttons and a D-pad, so opening up the map required pressing the B button and select at the same time. Now, the PSP has 8 buttons, a D-pad, and a circle pad, yet to open up the map in the PSP version is not a simple single button, but is pressing X, then select. This is insane to me. I have no idea why the map isn't tied to a single button when you've remade the game for a newer system with more buttons. Navigating the overworld can be slow. You can't dash there, and you're limited to moving in 4 directions instead of 8. The dungeons in the Soul of Chaos have areas mimicking the overworld that let you run in them, so I'm not sure why they couldn't extend that to the main overworld. There's no fast travel, which to be fair, doesn't become a problem once you get the airship. Fast travel isn't needed in a game like this, but is a simple way to speed things up. The early Dragon Quest games do a really good thing. When casting Zoom, you can fast travel to towns, and your boat will warp with you to the dock nearest that town. In Final Fantasy, the airship and boat stay where you leave them, causing you to walk the long way back to your boat if you ever need it, even after you get the airship. Each town's shop carries its own inventory, meaning if you need a specific item from the shop, you'll need to travel to the correct town. And memorizing which shop has which items is not something I was focused on doing. Every shop doesn't even sell antidote, which caused me at one point to travel halfway across the map just to stock up on them. When you enter a new shop for the first time, every past shop's inventory should be updated to include their existing selection and newly purchasable items. They could do the same thing with spell shops, keeping you from running around trying to remember which shop sold which level of spells. I talked about it a bit earlier, but including new maps for dungeons and towns to go along with the overworld map would make traversal much more streamlined. Having a button to toggle the map on and off in either the bottom left of the screen or show transparently over the entire screen would give you quick and easy access to this information. The simplicity of combat and lack of challenge becomes a baked-in part of the game's early design, but even a few things could have been done to rebalance or streamline the experience. Rebalancing both the main game and bonus content by further tweaking enemy stats and health wouldn't fix the simple combat, but would make it a bit more difficult, and in turn a bit more engaging. I think the experience would also be improved just by lowering the encounter rate. You wouldn't even have to do much else, as less battles means less experience and less money, making the game harder in that way. Adding a toggleable auto battle feature and even a 2x battle speed would help speed through the easy combat and make the tedious parts a little less so. There are moments when you get ambushed by a large group of enemies, and it takes forever to watch each of them attack, just to finish the fight with one or two multi-target spells the turn after. This is something that changing the battle speed could address. There are a lot of different versions of Final Fantasy that have been released over the years, starting with the Famicom version released in 1987. I'll go over the re-releases I feel added meaningful changes to the game. The first time this game had been remade was for the Japanese-only portable console, the WonderSwan, released in 1990. This version provided updates to the visuals, bringing it closer to the 16-bit era graphics and art style of the Super Famicom Final Fantasy games. Shops and the battle screen were redesigned, short cutscenes were added, a dash option was included when traversing towns and dungeons, along with other balancing and streamlining changes. In 2002, Final Fantasy Origins was released. This bundled Final Fantasy 1 and 2 on the original PlayStation. This version is based heavily on the WonderSwan release, with similar visuals but in higher resolution. It features a rewritten script closer to the Japanese release. The amount of characters used for the warrior names and magic names was increased to 6 from 4. Additionally, this version includes a few FMV cutscenes in easy mode, and new features such as a bestiary, art gallery, and item collection. In 2004, Final Fantasy 1 and 2 were remade for the Game Boy Advance under the title Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls. This version saw a forced reduced difficulty, putting it in line with the PlayStation's easy mode, and with no way to adjust the difficulty. But it was the first to include the additional Soul of Chaos dungeons. It also saw the addition of future Final Fantasy items, such as better potions, ether, and Phoenix Downs, among other balance changes. 2007 saw the release of the PlayStation Portable version. This version included all previous content of the past releases, plus the Labyrinth of Time dungeon, making this the version with the most content. In 2021, Final Fantasy was remade once again under the Pixel Remaster series. This remake features gorgeous reimagined pixel art, mostly based on the NES release. All previous versions saw updated soundtracks, but the Pixel Remaster has full-scale musical arrangements supervised by the original composer, Nobuo Uematsu, that sounds amazing. Some quality of life additions specific to this version include auto battle that reuses moves during the last turn, or uses the basic attack if started on the first turn. An on-screen map for the overworld, dungeons, and towns can be seen at all times. 8-way movement plus the ability to dash is extended to the overworld. All of these changes are welcome additions to help streamline and speed up actions. The Pixel Remaster re-release directly addresses most of the omitted changes I wanted to see in the PSP release. I wish I could stop here, but unfortunately I have a critique with this release. Bafflingly, all of the future content added to the Game Boy Advance and PSP versions of the game, the Soul of Chaos and Labyrinth of Time dungeons, have been removed from the Pixel Remaster release. I'm glad I ended up playing the PSP version. It's a culmination of all the versions that came before it, and adds new content and quality of life additions that make this one of the best ways, if not the best way to play the game. The Pixel Remaster does stand beside it, with all of its additional quality of life changes on top of that. I say if you don't plan to play the additional Soul of Chaos or Labyrinth of Time dungeons, then the Pixel Remaster is the cleanest, most accessible version of Final Fantasy, with the most quality of life additions present. If you do, however, want to play the version of Final Fantasy with the most content, then the PSP version is the definitive version to play. I'd say the worst thing you'd be missing out on, directly comparing the two games, is the lack of dungeon and town maps that were added to the Pixel Remaster, which maps can easily be found online if you don't mind taking the extra step. It's a real shame I can't just easily point to one single definitive version of the game, and that certain features need to be gained or lost depending on which version you play. I don't understand why the additional content of past releases couldn't make its way into the Pixel Remaster. Though the content is tedious, it adds new dungeons, along with fun and even difficult boss fights, that are a fun celebration of Final Fantasy's history. I wanted to see this content preserved and accessible, regardless of its quality. As a huge fan of the turn-based JRPG genre, it was an interesting experience playing not only the first game in a long-running series, but one of the games that helped popularize and standardize the genre. Final Fantasy is a solid experience with a simple story that later introduces a unique and defining aspect, but doesn't do much to fully realize it. The player is guided well through most of the game, while providing you with the utmost freedom to explore. The most poorly aged and sadly the most prominent aspect of the game is its simple, easy, and tedious combat, with a high encounter rate that overstays its welcome through the entirety of the main story. The PSP remake adds plenty of quality of life changes, but stops short of adding even more that could have improved the experience without changing it. The Soul of Chaos and Labyrinth of Time dungeons more than double the runtime, and while these dungeons themselves could have also seen improvements to limit the tedium and repeated content, they still include unique and challenging bosses that celebrate Final Fantasy's 20th anniversary. This shows to me that they were capable of adding more balanced content, and I wish those efforts made their way into the main game. When deciding to pick up this game, I was mostly interested in the history of Final Fantasy, rather than comparing it to other games, so I was willing to overlook a lot. With that in mind, I did have a good time playing Final Fantasy. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more like it, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. I also stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/RyanBeardy, follow me on Twitter at RyanBeardy, and I have a Discord with the links below.